Fidel Castro came to power after the Cuban Revolution, and his relations with the USA quickly began to sour, as he seized a lot of assets owned by American businesses, so he was denounced as a communist, and in 1961, the Americans tried to invade using an army of Cuban refugees. This, however, the Bay of Pigs invasion failed, but President Kennedy was still determined to remove Castro from power, fearing he could help other socialist revolutions in Latin America. But the CIA's assassination attempts also failed, and he remained in power, so in early 1962, Cuba was kicked out of the Organization of American States, and Kennedy embargoed more Cuban goods, so Castro, fearing a full-scale invasion, was imminent, strengthened his ties with the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in the Cold War arms race, Kennedy had campaigned on closing the missile gap, wrongfully believing that the Soviets had more missiles. But in the early 60s, two events heightened tensions between the two superpowers. First of all, in 1961, construction on the Berlin Wall began, and Kennedy's handling of the crisis led Khrushchev to believe that he was weak and ineffective, and then in 1962, the Americans stationed missiles in Turkey, well within range of major Soviet cities, so Castro, still fearing an invasion, allowed the Soviets to construct missiles in Cuba in 1962, which when constructed would put American cities in range of an attack. Although the project was initially a secret, by the end of the year the Americans had found out. Thanks to Cuban immigrants and a U-2 spy plane, in mid-October, Kennedy put together a team of advisors as part of XCOM. To deal with this situation, some called the Doves favored diplomacy, while the Hawks advocated for the use of force or an all-out invasion. However, an all-out invasion could not be justified internationally, and the Soviets could retaliate. So Kennedy finally settled on a naval blockade on the 22nd, believing it didn't back Khrushchev into a corner and force him to respond aggressively. Plus, if it failed, other options were still available. Kennedy then went on TV and made the situation public. Khrushchev responded on the 24th in a letter to Kennedy, stating that this was an act of aggression, and his ships would defy the blockade. Some Soviet ships, being shadowed by a submarine, reached the quarantine line the same day, but initially held their position, and some even withdrew. However, some Soviet cargo ships, carrying no weapons, were able to pass through the blockade. But the United States still raised their security level to DEFCON 2, as it seemed the missiles were nearing operational level, and the rest of the world went into high alert. So Kennedy ordered more flights over Cuba, and talks of an invasion began again. On the 26th, Khrushchev sent a letter, promising to remove the missiles, in return for Kennedy promising not to invade Cuba, but sent a second letter later on, also asking for the US to remove their missiles from Turkey. Meanwhile, a US spy plane was shot down over Cuba, and Castro asked the Soviets to fire the missiles, should an invasion take place. So nearing a war neither side were ready for, the two powers secretly met and agreed to terms. The missiles from both Turkey and Cuba would be removed, and America promised not to invade Cuba. So the crisis ended peacefully. In order to prevent anything similar happening again, a hotline was set up in both the Kremlin and the White House to allow direct communication, and in the following years, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty tried to prevent more nations from developing nuclear weapons. However, because the removal of missiles from Turkey was kept a secret, Khrushchev seemed like he was backing down, and this helped play a part in him being removed from power just 2 years later. And the Cuban Missile Crisis also had some long-term consequences. In the East during the crisis, Mao took advantage of the world being preoccupied with Cuba and invaded India during the brief Sino-Indian War. Plus, Mao also criticized Khrushchev for backing down, and this was one of the causes behind the Sino-Soviet split. As for Cuba, the United States kept some form of embargo on Cuba for decades, and Cuban-Soviet relations also began to sour. For instance, Castro was angry with the Soviets for withdrawing. Without addressing the American base in Guantanamo Bay, the Soviets also began to speak out against Cuba's attempts of encouraging revolutions across Latin America and Africa. Plus, in the context of the Sino-Soviet split, people like Che Guevara began to favor China as an ally.